Something new has started hunting Florida's massive pythons. For years, these serpents ruled the Everglades without question, the undisputed apex predator, the creature that consumed alligators whole, drained entire wetlands of wildlife, and feared absolutely nothing that moved through those waters. Then the biologists monitoring them began losing track of them. One radio signal after another went silent. And at every location the researchers reached, there was no body, no blood, no indication that anything had taken place at all. Just the transmitter, still chirping, still pulsing steadily from inside something that had swallowed an apex predator whole and slipped back into the dark water. Then a camera finally captured what was responsible, and the footage left an entire room of biologists, completely without words. The disappearing data. Let me step back and walk you through how this whole thing began, because it all started as the most ordinary science you could imagine. Bartoshik and his team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida were running what looked, on paper, like a routine field study across the wetlands of the Picayune Strand and the borders of Big Cypress National Preserve. Surgical transmitters placed inside Burmese pythons, radio tracking through the swampland, movement corridors, hunting ranges, survival data gathered day after day alongside the Conservancy's python team and with support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The kind of slow, careful, unglamorous work that ends up filed in a database rather than splashed across the news. Here is what you need to understand before any of what follows makes any sense. In the Everglades, the Burmese python sits at the very top, the apex predator, the thing everything else has learned to avoid. It is the animal that consumes alligators, takes down deer without effort, hollows out a wetland, and keeps on feeding. Nothing living in that swamp was supposed to be capable of touching it. That was the entire reason these researchers were tracking pythons to begin with, to understand the monster, not to discover what was preying on it. Day after day, they waded through chest-high water and followed the signals. Heat pressing down like a physical weight, cypress roots catching at their boots, saw grass sharp enough to slice skin without a moment's notice. The transmitters themselves were no small thing. These were not fragile little tags clipped onto a scale. They were surgical units implanted directly inside the animals, designed to broadcast for months, built to keep sending signals through miles of flooded wilderness, no matter where the snake traveled. So when one goes quiet, your immediate thought is equipment failure, a drained battery, a waterlogged unit. Your first instinct is never simply that the snake itself has vanished. Pythons of this size do not just disappear, and then the signals started dying, not the transmitters. That is the detail that really needs to hit you. The equipment kept pulsing right on schedule, every few seconds. A clean electronic heartbeat broadcasting from a fixed point deep in the swamp. It was the pythons connected to that equipment that were disappearing. Python 19 was the first. 3 weeks of clean, consistent data, movement patterns, rest cycles, activity windows, all of it predictable and completely normal, and then total stillness. Not the stillness of a cold-blooded creature slowing down on a cool morning, not a rest interval between feeding sessions, the specific absolute stillness that means only one thing. The team pushed through cypress and saw grass and standing water to reach the coordinates, and when they arrived, every single person stopped moving at exactly the same moment. No carcass, no blood, no drag marks, no shed skin, nothing disturbed in any direction. Just that faint, steady pulse broadcasting from inside something else's gut. They circled the area, checked the water, the surrounding brush, the nearby tree line, traced the signal all the way to its source, and found simply nothing. Nothing except a transmitter beeping up from the mud, a clue with no crime scene yet attached to it. Something had swallowed their python whole, transmitter and all. And whatever that something was, it was still out there, still moving, still digesting. Take a moment to consider what that actually requires. A Burmese python is not something that gets hunted. It is a powerfully built, rapidly growing constrictor, the creature other animals flee from. And yet something lurking in that swamp had taken one down so thoroughly that a trained crew standing right on the spot could not find a single trace that it had ever happened, a crime scene. In October of that same year, 2 more signals went dead. 2 more pythons vanished without a carcass, without evidence, without a single drop of blood. 2 more transmitters blinking patiently from coordinates where living animals had once been. Once is a fluke. A 1 in 1,000 occurrence you could chalk up to bad luck and never expect to encounter again. But this was 3. 3 snakes, 3 transmitters, every single one recovered from inside something the team was unable to identify. Something still out there, hunting in a swamp, crawling with researchers and cameras, and not one person had ever seen it. So they brought what little they had back to the lab and ran x-rays. And then they stood in front of that imaging screen and fell completely silent. One of the people involved later described how the work had stopped feeling like science and begun to feel like a criminal investigation. Wildlife CSI, hovering over a patch of wetland where a body should have been, because that is precisely what it was. They were no longer tracking pythons. They were investigating their deaths, with no suspect, no weapon, and no framework for what they were even searching for. A python's spine, completely intact, curled inside the stomach of something else. The surgical transmitter still sitting right there, still broadcasting, still sending its signal from deep inside a predator nobody could name. One of the animals they reconstructed from the data had weighed more than 50 pounds and stretched nearly 13 feet in length. Its neck had been destroyed. Its body was found buried beneath brush. Something had killed an apex predator of that size, swallowed it whole, and slipped back into the water. A 13-foot Burmese python is not prey to anything in any version of that swamp anyone had ever charted. It is the creature that empties wetlands, and something had treated it like a routine meal. Bartoszek later described it as the most surreal moment of his 20 years working in the field. 20 years of learning every animal in those swamps, every track, every tooth mark, every way a thing could die out there. And he was standing in front of an image he simply could not explain. Notice what that image quietly ruled out. Whatever did this had not torn the python apart or scattered it in pieces to decompose. It had taken the entire animal in one piece, bones, transmitter, and all, and kept it down long enough to begin digesting it. That is not scavenging. That is not opportunism. That is a predator built specifically to swallow something close to its own size, deliberately and completely. And the list of animals in Florida capable of doing exactly that is nearly empty. Here is the thing about a Burmese python. It does not belong here, not even remotely. This animal evolved on the opposite side of the planet, in the steaming jungles and wetlands of Southeast Asia, in Myanmar and Thailand and Vietnam. Those places spent millions of years constructing food webs specifically designed to hold it in check. Predators that hunted it, competitors that crowded it out, disease pressures that thinned its numbers, an entire invisible architecture of biological constraint, refined across geological time. None of it made the crossing with the snakes. The exotic pet trade of the 1980s and 1990s shipped thousands of baby pythons into the United States. They were inexpensive, visually striking, and easy to sell to people who had absolutely no idea what they were actually taking home. Because then, those babies grew. They stretched to 15 feet, 18, 20, and the people who had wanted a manageable exotic pet made a quiet, catastrophic decision. They drove them out to the canals and wetlands and margins of the Everglades and simply let them go. Living weapons released into a landscape with no evolutionary memory of what a Burmese python even was. Then came 1992, when Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida and ripped open commercial breeding facilities, sending hundreds more directly into the wild in a single night. What had been a slow trickle turned into a torrent. These snakes arrived to find no natural predators waiting for them. Nothing had evolved to chase them down. Nothing had been taught to fear them. They stepped into paradise as flawless killing machines and simply began to feed. What followed is almost too staggering to say out loud. Raccoon populations in the affected areas collapsed by 99.3%. Not declined, collapsed. Opossums fell by 98.9%. Bobcats dropped by 87.5%. Marsh rabbits, muskrats, cottontails, effectively wiped from landscapes they had occupied for thousands of years. Full-grown white-tailed deer swallowed whole. American alligators, armored survivors of the extinction event that erased the dinosaurs, consumed in single sittings. Dozens of bird species recovered from python stomachs, among them migratory birds that had traveled all the way from Canada to spend winter in Florida. This did not unfold over centuries. It happened across decades, in certain places, across just a handful of years. Dr. Frank Mazzotti, a wildlife ecologist at the University of Florida who has devoted more than 20 years to studying this invasion, has placed the python population somewhere in the tens of thousands, possibly reaching the hundreds of thousands. An invisible army, perfectly camouflaged, endlessly patient, quietly tearing apart one of the most irreplaceable ecosystems in North America from within. And people threw everything they had at it. The federal government banned imports and designated the python as injurious wildlife. Florida launched bounty programs. Detection dogs were trained and deployed. Thermal drones swept over the sawgrass. Removal competitions drew hunters in from all across the country. Environmental DNA sampling, acoustic monitoring, aerial thermal surveys, multiple agencies, even the Army Corps of Engineers was brought in to help coordinate the response. Nothing moved the needle. Every serious researcher who spent real time in the field eventually landed on the same grim conclusion. They worded it delicately in grant applications and bluntly over coffee, but it always came down to the same thing. The pythons had won. The Everglades were being lost. Mazzotti said it plainly, standing out in the field after 3 weeks wading through the water. The ecosystem was being eaten alive, and no predator existed that could stop it. Nobody disagreed. The numbers left no room for argument. And then the transmitters started going dark on Bartok's monitors, and the answer that came back was one that nobody across the entire state had ever thought to model. Every theory turned out to be wrong. Something was consuming apex predators whole, leaving behind zero evidence and slipping back into the swamp as though nothing had happened. That much they were certain of. Everything beyond that point, they got completely wrong. One theory at a time. A massive alligator was the obvious first guess, the apex of the apex somewhere out there. But the evidence refused to support it. Alligators crush, they death roll, they leave catastrophic, unmistakable damage at a kill site, shattered bones, torn flesh, partially consumed remains scattered across a wide area. These vanished pythons showed none of that. No wounds, no markings, just gone. A Florida panther then, but panthers ambush their prey. They bite through skull or spine. They leave puncture wounds, claw marks, the unmistakable signature of a large cat. There was nothing. No fur caught on nearby brush, no scratches, no paw prints pressed into the mud. A black bear, powerful, opportunistic, capable of remarkable things. But bears do not swallow 13-foot snakes in a single piece. The mechanism was simply all wrong. They worked through every serious predator in the Everglades food chain. Hawks, owls, other large constrictors. Each one raised, examined, and ruled out, in turn. Whatever was responsible, operated by a method their models couldn't even generate. So they did the only thing a research team with no answers can do. They mounted cameras across the study area, aimed at every location where a signal had gone silent, and waited. Weeks of empty footage rolled by, saw grass swaying in the breeze, wading birds working the shallows, the occasional raccoon drifting through the frame. Hour after hour of the swamp, behaving exactly the way swamps behave, which is quietly and without any drama worth noting. Field cameras have no interest in your schedule. The team cycled through memory cards, swapped out batteries, sat in darkened rooms going through clip after clip, and came up empty. Then one morning, a researcher pulled up a single piece of footage, and the entire review session came to a halt. Nobody in that room spoke for a very long time. The predator on screen was not an alligator, not a panther, not a bear, or a hawk, or anything from anybody's working list. It wasn't even particularly large. What the camera showed was a thick, dark-bodied snake, heavy, muscular, lying completely still in the leaf litter at the water's edge, disappearing entirely against the rotting vegetation underneath it. A textbook ambush. The kind of animal you could walk directly over on a trail and never once register. And then it moved. Explosive, precise, instantaneous. It locked onto a juvenile python before the prey had any sense of what was coming. The strike was over almost faster than the camera could capture it. No warning, no telegraphing, just contact and then control. It was a Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper that had been living in those very wetlands for thousands of years. An animal every single researcher on that team had stepped around on the trail 100 times without giving it a second thought. And there it was, hunting an invasive Burmese python and swallowing it whole. One native snake consuming another snake. The overlooked animal, the one that had always been there, winning. The footage showed it working slowly and methodically, unhinging its jaws around the python's tail and walking the entire body down its throat, inch by inch, until the other snake had simply ceased to exist. No thrashing, no struggle at the end. Just a patient, mechanical process, a predator doing something it had clearly done thousands of times before, on prey that happened to be one of the most feared invasive species on the continent. That was the detail that hit the watching team hardest. This was not some freak occurrence, not a once-in-a-decade act by a desperate or cornered animal. It was routine. The cottonmouth wasn't improvising, it was feeding. The X-rays confirmed the rest. In one documented case, the cottonmouth measured somewhere between 34 and 42 inches. The python inside it was nearly the same length. A snake-consuming prey approaching its own body length, pressing right up against the outer edge of what anyone had considered physically possible. The image looked less like a meal and more like a violation of logic, one snake folded completely inside another. One biologist on the team described it as watching evolution fight back in real time. Bartoshek didn't celebrate. He didn't frame it as a victory. He stood in front of that X-ray for a long time because what it confirmed wasn't simply one predation event. It was a possibility nobody had ever modeled, a mechanism nobody had thought to search for, a native animal that had been out there the whole time doing precisely what it was built to do, while every camera and every expert in the state was focused somewhere else entirely. The perfect killer. In hindsight, none of this should have caught anyone off guard. The Florida cottonmouth, Agkistrodon conanti, is one of the most consistently underestimated predators in North America. Adults measure 30 to 48 inches, with rare individuals exceeding 6 feet. Heavy, muscular animals built specifically for semi-aquatic life. Flooded cypress swamps, drowned grass prairies, blackwater root systems, exactly the landscape the Burmese python moved into. This was always cottonmouth country. The python simply arrived and occupied it. That famous display, the coiled body, the dropped jaw, the flash of white cotton inside the mouth, is only the warning signal. The real weapon stays hidden. Cottonmouths are pit vipers. A heat-sensing pit organ located between the eye and nostril on each side of the head reads infrared radiation with remarkable accuracy. They hunt in heat. Darkness is irrelevant to them. Camouflage gives them nothing. Even a cold-blooded python, carrying slightly more warmth than the water around it after lying in the sun or processing a meal, generates enough thermal contrast to be detected in complete blackness. There is no escaping a cottonmouth on its home ground. The python's single greatest survival tool, the natural camouflage that allows it to disappear from human search parties standing mere feet away, is worthless against a creature that tracks prey through heat rather than vision. And then there is the venom. Hemotoxic, sharpened across millions of years to break down tissue and blood cells from within. Untreated bites carry a genuine chance of killing a healthy grown adult. For smaller animals, death comes almost without exception within minutes. The cottonmouth never needs to win a grappling match. A python kills through constriction, needing to coil, grip, compress, and outlast. A cottonmouth delivers one well-aimed strike and retreats. The poison does the rest against a juvenile python that hasn't yet built adult-level crushing power. The confrontation ends before it truly gets started. And here is the detail that reframes everything. Cottonmouths are known to feed on more than 24 snake species as an ordinary part of their diet, including fellow cottonmouths. They are ophiophagus by design, by instinct, shaped by millions of years of hard-wired behavior. To a cottonmouth, a long, soft-bodied, ground-dwelling reptile is simply food in a recognizable form. So this was never a new skill the invasion compelled them to learn. This is just what cottonmouths have always done. The Burmese python was simply a new addition to a very old menu. Their method with large or dangerous prey is measured and precise: strike and release, pull back, and wait. 3 confirmed kills documented within a single study area over the span of a few months. That is a pattern, not chance. Biologists now suspect cottonmouths have identified juvenile pythons as high-value, low-resistance targets, zeroing in on the specific window when a python is big enough to be worth pursuing, but not yet big enough to pose a real danger. But what nobody anticipated came next. The cottonmouths were not operating alone, not fighting this battle by themselves. Bartoszek's own tracking records had quietly been telling a second story the entire time. No one had put the full picture together until the transmitters dragged it into plain view. Of the 19 monitored pythons in the study, 5 were killed by American alligators, and one of those alligators measured only 9 feet. These ancient animals had been pushing back the whole time, steadily, continuously, and entirely without documentation, not retreating, not learning to live alongside the pythons, but killing them. The fact that a 9-foot alligator could bring down one of these snakes matters enormously. It means this wasn't only massive bull alligators doing the heavy lifting. It was ordinary mid-sized swamp residents, the kind found throughout the entire ecosystem. Then in June of 2021, a wildlife camera captured something without precedent anywhere in the scientific record. A bobcat, a species whose own numbers had been devastated by this very invasion, attacked a python nest, not scavenging, not wandering onto abandoned eggs. It went straight at the nesting female, striking repeatedly with both front paws, forcing her back with relentless aggression, then systematically worked through the entire clutch, egg by egg. A bobcat weighs a fraction of what a nesting Burmese python does. That python was built to defend her nest against nearly anything. The bobcat walked in regardless, and it won. It was the first photographic evidence ever captured of a native mammal actively raiding a Burmese python nest. These cats were learning to dismantle the invasion from the inside, developing entirely new hunting behaviors within a single lifetime in response to a threat that had not existed even 1 generation before. That is not how things are supposed to unfold on paper. Behavioral adaptation at this scale is supposed to require many generations, not a single lifespan. One ecologist who viewed the footage said it plainly. The bobcats had worked it out before the researchers even caught on. Cameras mounted above flooded terrain captured owls and hawks snatching juvenile pythons from exposed positions at dusk and early morning, pulling them from the ecosystem before they had any chance to grow into the kind of giants that swallow deer whole. Remove a python at 18 inches long and you also eliminate every deer, every wading bird, every alligator. That animal would have taken across decades of living. A small kill made early ripples outward in ways that compound enormously over time. Black bears and Florida panthers were also documented taking pythons across numerous locations throughout the study area. An entire coalition had quietly taken shape without a single moment of coordination. Pit vipers working through the leaf litter, raptors sweeping down from the canopy, bobcats zeroing in on nests, alligators wading in the water, bears moving through the brush, all of them acting independently, all simply doing what millions of years of evolution had shaped them to do. Hold ground against something that has no business being there. No directive was issued. No species convened a meeting. They converged on the same target from 5 entirely different angles at the same time. That ought to mean something. In many ways, it genuinely does. But the people who sit closest to this data are far too careful to call any of it a rescue. The brutal math, because there is a number working against every single bit of it. And that number shows no mercy. A single female Burmese python lays anywhere from 12 to 36 eggs in a clutch, and sometimes even more. She coils her entire body around the nest for the full incubation period, shivering her own muscles to produce heat, defending it against anything that dares come close. These animals grow quickly and live for decades on end. The reproductive math does not concern itself with whatever defenders have assembled against it. Even when predators hit a nest hard, a handful of survivors is all that's needed. Those survivors grow up, they reproduce. The curve does not climb in a straight line, it compounds, and that engine never stops running. Since Florida's removal program first got underway, human hunters have pulled more than 5,000 pythons out of the wild. The 2024 Florida Python Challenge took nearly 200 animals out of circulation in a single weekend. On its own, that sounds like something significant. Then you set it beside Mazzotti's assessment that all of it combined is barely making a dent. Nobody who has studied this problem at any real depth disagrees with that. Pythons conceal themselves to a degree that edges toward the supernatural. Researchers have walked within just a few feet of a fully coiled, completely alert animal and registered absolutely nothing. Enormous stretches of habitat simply cannot be reached on foot. That is the wall every effort eventually runs straight into. Not a shortage of determination or funding, just a swamp too enormous and far too skilled at hiding what lives inside it. And still, every action matters. Every cottonmouth strike, every bobcat raid, every alligator kill, every transmitter recovered from an unidentified stomach. Each one is a data point, another pixel, in a picture that is only now beginning to take shape. Each one buys the Everglades a little more time. Time for native predators to sharpen these behaviors and carry them forward. Time for researchers to develop better tools. Time for the ecosystem to remember how to stand up for itself. The cottonmouths did not wait around for anyone's permission. They simply began hunting. The bobcats did not consult any recovery document. They attacked. While humans were drafting grant applications and arranging interagency meetings, the swamp had already started fighting back entirely on its own terms. The cameras have confirmed without question that it is happening. There is only one thing the footage still cannot tell us. The war goes on. Is it happening fast enough? That is the entire question. And right now, not a single person on this planet can answer it with any real confidence. Whether the cottonmouth that learned to target a juvenile python can carry that behavior through enough generations to bend the population curve. Whether the bobcat that raided a nest this season shifts the whole dynamic a decade down the road. Whether all of it combined, pit vipers, alligators, bobcats, raptors, and human hunters working right alongside them actually adds up to something the reproductive math of a Burmese python simply cannot absorb and outlast. Well, nobody really knows. And that uncertainty is precisely what keeps people like Bartok wading back into the black water, season after season. The study is still going. The cameras have not stopped rolling. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida is growing its transmitter network, watching closely for the one signal that matters above all else, that the native ecosystem is genuinely closing the gap. Bartok looks at those monitors now with a quality of attention he simply did not have when this whole thing started. He is no longer just tracking pythons. He is tracking the creatures that have been quietly hunting them all along. And somewhere out in the Everglades tonight, deep in the black water of the Picayune Strand, a cottonmouth is digesting a python whole, its transmitter still pulsing softly from somewhere inside it. Less than a mile away, 100 python eggs are in the middle of hatching. That right there is the entire war compressed into a single stretch of swamp. One native predator winning silently in the dark, and 100 new invaders arriving to fill the exact space it just cleared out. The cottonmouth has no awareness of being part of anything bigger than itself. It is simply doing what it has always done in the only place it has ever known against something that never should have been there in the first place. No grant funded it. No agency gave it the green light. It just happens in the dark every single night. So here is what I want from you before you head out. Drop it in the comments. Do you actually think the Everglades can claw its way back from this? Or has the python already won this thing for good? I read every single one. And hit subscribe before you go, because the cameras are still running. The study has not stopped. And the next thing that surfaces out there could change absolutely everything. You want to be around when that happens.